Introducing Eileen Shader. Eileen Shader is Director of River Restoration at American Rivers. She leads the organization's National Floodplain Program to build capacity for equitable, integrated, and nature-based floodplain management. Through this initiative, she seeks to reform local, state, and federal floodplain management policy, fosters a nationwide floodplain community of practice, and builds institutional capacity to implement and manage floodplain restoration projects. She serves as co-chair of the Natural and Beneficial Functions Committee of the Association of State Floodplain Managers and helps lead the Natural Floodplain Functions Alliance. Eileen is a certified floodplain manager and has an MA in Natural Resources Policy from George Washington University and a BS from Elizabethtown College. So please join me in welcoming Eileen to the stage. Let's see here.
As Adam said, I'm Eileen Shader with American Rivers. I like to describe my role as working at the confluence of flood risk management and river restoration or river conservation. These are two different fields of practitioners that work in the same physical environment, but there's a ton of silos and lots of people don't actually communicate across these different worlds. So part of my job is to try and break down those silos and get people talking to each other. So today, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of our floodplain restoration approach at American Rivers, and then talk about the National Action Plan to protect and restore floodplains that we are working on with a bunch of our partners. It's definitely not going to be a beaver-focused talk. I think of beavers as a process, a tool, a strategy for restoring floodplains, so consider beavers are a part of all of this that I'm talking about and a means to achieve these outcomes. So, if you're not familiar with American Rivers, we're a national conservation organization that works to protect wild rivers, restore damaged rivers, and conserve clean water for people and nature. We have staff across the country, but as a national organization, we're actually fairly small. We only have like 85 to 90 staff total. We do a lot of sort of federal policy work and national sort of leadership within the river conservation community, and then our staff throughout the country work on either on-the-ground projects or on state level or regional initiatives to try and build more capacity for protection and restoration of rivers. Within our river restoration program, which is where I sit within American Rivers, we have two primary strategies that we use. First is dam removal, so not beaver dams. We're talking about generally we are trying to remove dams that are causing either a significant fish passage or aquatic harm, or are a significant liability, and oftentimes those end up being the ones that we remove because people have actually died at these outdated dams that we don't have a purpose for anymore. So we're not trying to remove every dam. That's like just not possible. We're really trying to prioritize the ones that we don't need anymore and that are causing problems. When it comes to our restoration program, we're probably much more well known for the dam removal work that we do, and we've been doing it for several decades. So our floodplain restoration program is much newer. It evolved from sort of focusing primarily on the federal policy related to floodplains, so National Flood Insurance Program, the Army Corps of Engineers, and then several years ago, I started thinking, well, how do we know if we're actually making the policy changes that are actually going to result in more floodplain restoration on the ground? If we're not doing the projects on the ground, if we don't have staff, if we aren't well connected to those practitioners, how can we ensure that we're serving the results we want to see? So we started putting staff out there, engaging more with folks on the ground. We started basically in California, in the Central Valley. If anybody's familiar with that, it's a hugely levied program system with lots of flood risk issues, lots of aquatic habitat issues. And we also out there work on the in the Sierra Nevada headwaters and do beaver dam analog projects within the headwaters. From California, we expanded our floodplain staff to work in Washington State with the integrated floodplain management program there called Washington or Floodplains by Design. Every program that they fund has to reduce flood risk, and it has to protect or restore salmon habitat. So from there, we now have expanded our staff reach around the country, now have about 25 staff that are not solely working on floodplain issues and floodplain projects, but are doing some work related to floodplains and flood policy. So I want to sort of start by talking about how we define floodplains within the United States. And if any of you are the policy geeks, like this is my area, I'm sorry for the rest of you that aren't. But our floodplain management within the country is largely dictated by the National Flood Insurance Program, which defines a floodplain for regulatory purposes as the 1% annual chance flood. And that standard was set in 1973. That was when the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, was created to basically create a standard for mapping flood hazard areas and issuing regulations for development of flood-prone areas. And they decided to go with the 100-year because it fell between the larger standard that the Army Corps was using, which tended to be like the 200 to 500-year frequency level of flooding, and the more frequent standard that stormwater managers would use, which was more of like a 5 to 20-year frequency standard. So it was kind of totally arbitrary. It just seemed like a decent middle point of where we could get some agreement on which floodplain areas to regulate for development. And now that's the standard of the land. So when FEMA maps the 100-year floodplain, communities then have to manage development within that area. There's no development within the quote-unquote floodway. It's the area in the middle there. But development can occur within the fringe, so on that outside area. It's supposed to not, development is not supposed to impact flood heights, so technically it's supposed to be elevated, it's supposed to be flood-proofed. But the takeaway is that for 50 years, we have used this 100-year flood determination to drive floodplain policy decisions across the federal government, across states, across local communities. And it has actually ended up encouraging development within our floodplains. And that has resulted in a really significant loss of natural functioning floodplains across the nation. So rather than just use that regulatory definition, we like to use a definition of floodplains that's really focused on function. I have adapted this definition from some work from Jeff Opperman, who's a floodplain researcher who a lot of our science is based on. Functioning floodplains are landscape features that are formed and influenced by rivers and coast upon which biophysical processes and ecosystems operate. So I like this definition because it tends to incorporate sort of the geomorphologist perspective, the ecologist perspective, and as well as sort of the more physical definition for flooding. And if we want to have a functional floodplain, the research tends to show that there are 4 attributes that you need for functions to occur. You need your river to be connected to the floodplain. You need natural flows, and I think what's important to note there is that you want regular inundation that's appropriate for the place. So you want it to be at the right time of the year, for the right duration, for the right depth of flow, and as we all know, that's all going to be really important, especially if you're trying to do restoration for the benefit of a specific species. Third is we need spatial scale, so we want projects that are big enough to make a difference. Land is expensive, and obviously it can be really challenging to do really big projects. So one of one of the ways to sort of adapt to that is to do a lot of little small projects within a watershed and sort of do them in a much more connected way. And finally, habitat and spatial diversity. The things that beavers get us. So if we can put beavers on our floodplain, that's going to help us get to some of that habitat and structural diversity. So when we define floodplain restoration, there's a million different tools, a million different strategies that you can use. As I mentioned, like beaver are one of those. We take this broad definition of that floodplain restoration project as anything that's going to restore natural habitat features and reconnect rivers to floodplains during flood events at a scale that will provide meaningful environmental benefits. I added that little beaver there just for you guys. So the two primary strategies that our staff on the ground use, as I mentioned, restoration of Headwater Meadows. We've got staff in the Sierra Nevadas that are doing beaver dam analog projects, and we have a lot of staff that are really interested in doing more of these in Colorado and Washington and some of the other regions where it's appropriate. I do have, if anybody wants to learn more about that, let me know. I can put you in touch with my colleagues, Julie, out in California, because they know a ton more than I do. The second type of project that we tend to do is more of these big floodplain reconnection projects. So altering levees, doing levee setbacks, removing outdated levees that we don't need anymore. These can be really hard to do, really, really, really complicated. We do manage a few in California, and much more of our time is spent in trying to work on the regional flood plans that identify potential projects and then help make that happen. At American Rivers, we are focused on trying to address three urgent crises that we believe are impacting our rivers. First is the climate crisis, increasing floods and droughts and water scarcity. This is a picture actually just from yesterday. If y'all didn't hear the Yellowstone, there's terrible flooding happening in Montana. Like all of Yellowstone is closed, the national park, because it's been pretty tragic. Second is biodiversity crisis, and third is the racial justice crisis, which we have really been integrating a lot more of racial justice into our work, which I won't be able to get into here because of the time constraints, but rest assured that much of our flood management, our floodplain restoration is really focused on equitable outcomes and working with and for and in concert with the BIPOC communities and tribal nations that tend to be the most disproportionately harmed by polluted rivers and flooding. All right, so I won't labor this point. We all know how many benefits that floodplains can have. The point that I usually try to make for folks is that floodplains are dynamic, and as we saw with that NFIP definition of what a floodplain is, that's a very static definition. You know, we draw a line and then expect that that's where water's going to stay. That is not the case. And that interaction of the water and the land is really what catalyzes the chemical and biological and physical processes that make floodplains productive landscapes that give us these benefits to society. And while we are working to both try and restore and protect floodplains, one of the key things that we need to do is be able to demonstrate and quantify all of the benefits that floodplains and all of our natural systems can provide to society. Like at the federal level, it all comes down to like your benefit cost analysis. We need to be able to demonstrate and show and put numbers on paper that show the benefit of these ecosystems. Because if not, we're trying to change the process, but it's really, really, really dang hard. So in the meantime, we need to keep trying to actually demonstrate the benefits that these ecosystems have. And one of the challenges that we have right now is that while nature-based solutions like protection and restoration of floodplains are definitely growing in popularity and acceptance, it's still a really niche area. There's still kind of a lack of data. There's a lack of knowledge within the practitioner community about how to do these projects. And we end up not having policies, or our existing policies, I should say, they create these unintended barriers to using nature-based solutions, which then present all these challenges with trying to get timely and adequate funding to implement projects. There has been efforts in the past to try and overcome some of these issues, to try and do things like bring together the flood risk management community and the conservation community and create more of a unified strategy for how we're managing our nation's floodplains. Like after the 1993 flood in the Midwest, huge catastrophic flooding event on the Mississippi River, we updated what's called the Unified National Program for Floodplain Management. And the really important thing that did was it established these dual goals for United States floodplain management. First, a reduction in loss of life, disruption, and damage caused by floods. And second, preservation and restoration of natural resources and functions of floodplains. So there have been efforts to do this. We have set the stage to have this sort of national leadership, but it hasn't fully been implemented. There are a number of different challenges that come down to, like, we don't have the legal authority for this. It's not in statute, it's not in law, it's just kind of a good thing that we think we should do, and it's written into all different sorts of documents, but it's not, we don't have the hook to be able to really enforce it. It's also supposed to be implemented by an interagency group called the Federal Interagency Floodplain Management Task Force, or the FIFMTIF, which is like the worst acronym. I know. But there's no clear sort of agency lead on who's supposed to be in charge of that. Nobody has ownership. And probably the biggest issue is that because this is a subject that's sort of within the whims of the White House and whoever's in the administration, we end up seeing like progress on this every 2 years. After a president comes in, 2 years into their presidency, somebody's like, oh, hey, there's this cool thing. We should really do something on that and reconvene this FIFMTIF. And so they get to work, they come up with a work plan, and maybe they do one or two things, and then we have an election and somebody else is in office. And so we have to start all over and over again. So these are the challenges that we've been trying to work with, and people in floodplain management community have been really frustrated about. So a handful of years ago, leaders in the wetland and the floodplain management community sort of realized that this wasn't being implemented, that there was a key barrier within their practitioner groups. A key barrier was the failure to integrate the floodplain data and the mapping that would get us more co-equal floodplain management. So they sort of realized, okay, well, both wetland managers, both floodplain managers use a process of functional assessment. So, methodology is to characterize physical, chemical, biological processes within an ecosystem. However, even though they were working in the same physical environment, there was minimal communication happening between these agencies, between these regions, users, stakeholders, and everybody's working in their silos. So it didn't seem like a very efficient use of time and resources. Thankfully, a group, formerly the Association of State Wetland Managers, now the National Association of Wetland Managers, they convened these two groups, the Natural Floodplain Functions Alliance and the Wetland Mapping Consortium. And they figured, well, let's get these two groups together and start figuring out how we can improve our mapping, how we can improve our functional assessment processes to more effectively protect and restore floodplains. So that was way too much to try and tackle in one workshop. So we ended up holding 4 workshops over several years. First by sort of getting the laying the groundwork in 2018, getting a sense of who was doing innovative work, where the opportunities were. In 2019, we started to dig into the data, the interoperability between the different agencies and levels of government, how we could create more user-friendly data sharing. And then finally, in 2021, we started exploring policy issues, like what are the actual policy barriers that are getting in the way of us implementing these projects. And finally, last fall, we held our final workshop, which was really focused on trying to identify solutions, coming up with an action plan, which at the time we were calling No Net Loss of Floodplain Functions, which, God, that name sucks too. And we realized that no net loss isn't enough. We need to be gaining floodplain lands. We need to be gaining natural floodplains. So it has turned into action plan to protect and restore floodplains. These are the 4 different buckets or pillars of that we delved into in the workshop and are included in our action plan. So we've got data, policy, funding, and communications. And I don't expect you to read this triangle. One of the things that became very clear through the workshop series was that we really need support and for this effort to be endorsed by agencies and organizations at multiple administrative and geographic or spatial levels. This data pyramid here is intended to communicate the scale and purpose of floodplain data collection and the analysis at multiple scales so that we can address the administrative and programmatic needs at the various levels. It shows a clear requirement for partnerships and data sharing across the different levels of administrative responsibility. I'm losing my notes here, but basically a need to work together and be sharing data, making sure that our systems work together and can communicate effectively. Throughout the workshop series, our data group, and I should mention, I am not a data person at all. I am definitely a policy wonk. They really identified 4 different major challenges. First was a lack of science-based protocols for data collection related to floodplain functions. Second was governance and the related funding to support that data collection. Third is that our current data sets, things like the National Wetlands Inventory, National Hydrology data set, are outdated. And if we don't have updated data and modern data, then our decision support tools aren't going to be as effective as we want them to be. Our second bucket, policy, and here's where I could talk for hours and hours about many of these issues, but I will just summarize by saying that one of the challenges that at the federal government, we have dozens of agencies that work on floodplains. Nobody has singular jurisdiction over floodplains. You've got the NFIP, you've got the Army Corps, you've got public lands, you've got EPA. Everybody's got something to say and something to do with floodplains. And oftentimes their missions and their objectives are actually unaligned. And then you get down into the nitty-gritty of policies and they don't work well together. The legal framework, as I mentioned before, for the NFIP, it does not include prioritization of protection and restoration of natural floodplains. So we're never actually going to get FEMA to protect, restore floodplains unless they have a legal mandate to do so. As I mentioned before, lack of sustained and bipartisan support for a unified program across the federal government. This all boils down to the local government. I mean, local communities are the ones that actually implement floodplain projects in many respects. They're the ones that manage their floodplains. And many of them want to do the right thing, are trying to do the right thing, but our regulations are designed to prevent development, but our restoration projects still have to go through the same process. And so they aren't designed to facilitate restoration projects. So there can be a lot of inconsistencies and challenges there. And then finally, lack of data and tools. All of these 4 pillars, they kind of mesh together. There's a lot of overlap between the challenges that affect them all. One thing I did also want to mention is that we have seen a lot of progress. There's a lot of discussion of this during the workshops. We've seen a lot of progress on pushing nature-based solutions in recent years, but that's come because of the absence of a unified sort of international strategy. So we see individual agencies that are getting the authority, that are taking the steps to implement nature-based solutions. This has some success, and we're seeing more projects on the ground, which is great, but it really doesn't solve the underlying issues. We need to really dig into where the conflicts exist at the policy level in order to make sure that we can scale up our implementation of nature-based solutions at the scale that's needed to address these climate crises. Funding, there's actually a ton of funding available for nature-based solutions, but it's overwhelming. There's a huge matrix of federal programs. They have conflicting objectives, and our benefit cost analysis process and decision-making doesn't actually value the things that we value, so it's tough to get our projects funded. And then communications, we had all of those definitions of nature-based solutions. Like, that's an issue that we have this vocabulary issues. Decision makers, the public, have a challenge understanding what it is we're talking about. They don't know about the complexity of floodplains, let alone beaver. But I would say there's really a thirst for knowledge and peer learning from the practitioner community. All right, so moving forward, and I added you some memes because the words are all going to be really boring. So our data recommendations, one, giving some authority for some federal agency to really be the authority of identifying and collecting national level data related to floodplain functions. Second, we need a coalition of partners that are willing to support this. Then third, we need to produce more data, better data, and then floodplain function maps as a result of that data. And we need money for those efforts, for sure. When it comes to policy, we have three different sort of buckets that we're looking at. One is reinvigorating that unified national program. We need federal leadership. We need the federal interagencies to set some goals and actually work to embrace the role of tracking and mapping floodplain functions across the country. They need the authority to do that. And importantly, we need to have a governance structure where we're not relying on the feds to do all this work. They need to be able to empower the locals, the states, the regional leadership who are doing the work on the ground, and really helping them to figure out how to integrate their floodplain management and conservation. I mentioned before, benefit cost analysis. That's a federal law and policies that we really need change for. I'm more optimistic than ever that because of some of the progress that the White House is making on this. I mentioned before, fostering state and regional innovation. We want to see more state programs like Washington's Floodplains by Design, like Vermont's Rivers program that take a really integrated floodplain management approach. For states that are doing a good job of integrating their floodplain management, we think they should be delegated some more federal authority, similar to like how the EPA lets states that are doing a good job to implement some of their clean water responsibilities. Can we do something similar with floodplain management so that we're not relying on FEMA to try and act as a regulatory agency? Skip ahead to funding. Obviously, new money, always going to be helpful. Increasing our existing, there is no single federal program that specifically funds floodplain restoration. There's a ton of programs that will potentially fund floodplain restoration or some floodplain restoration type activities, but there's no single funding source for that. So let's create one. Another thing that we need is, because there are so many federal funding programs, like, can we figure out a better way to help practitioners apply for them? Can we combine funding into bigger pots, simplify our process to be able to get money out the door? Finally, or I should say, improving our funding decision-making, benefit cost analysis again, but also there's laws out there or executive orders like this one, 11988, that basically says that federal money can't be spent on projects that are going to harm the floodplain. Well, every agency is supposed to, when they're doing a project, when they're supposed to assess the impact that their projects have. But we don't track that. There's no real enforcement. You know, when you do a NEPA analysis, there's going to be a line that says, like, does this comply with 11988? And everybody's like, sure. Like, we need to have a better sense of what our impact from the federal government is on floodplains. And again, then our third bucket here is fostering state and regional innovation, building the capacity, getting more practitioners to support each other, the things that Mike was talking about on even a grander scale of different people that are doing different types of floodplain restoration as well as beaver-related projects. And then finally, communications. There's a real need to to educate decision makers and even our agency staff for many agencies don't know a lot about these issues. There's a real need for internal education, talking to the public, getting more of our materials, our messages out there, positive stories. And then my final point is what I'm hoping, and our sort of takeaway for this is one of the things we're really working on is using this Natural Floodplain Functions Alliance to create a community of practice that can really foster more communication across practitioners nationwide. You know, establishing leaders at both the national level and in different regions, promoting the work that they're doing, fostering peer learning, providing regular opportunities for engagement across the peer community, both through virtual and in-person events moving forward. So I'll just end by saying we are finalizing our workshop report and all of these recommendations into an action plan. We already have some interest from the Council on Environmental Quality at the White House to talk to them about this. So I'm pretty optimistic that we'll at least get a little bit of progress on some of this. And then our next steps are really building out the community of practice. I'm going to be taking over leadership for the NFFA in July. If you are interested in joining us, we're looking for scientists, we're looking for practitioners, we're looking for agency leads in different regions that would be willing to engage and work with us and figure out how we get more of these projects done. And I definitely feel like there's an opportunity to integrate a lot of the work of the Beaver community into this work. So I think I will end there.
Thank you, Eileen. Thank you.